Hello everyone, and welcome to the Introduction to Transact SQL. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this whole concept of what Transact SQL is. It may surprise you that you actually have been working with Transact SQL. That's kind of the secret here. But so we'll talk about what it is, some of the difference between T-SQL and SQL, taking a look at T-SQL and what it's actually made up of. Transactions in T-SQL is something I want you to focus on because we need to know that for our next topic when it comes to stored procedures. And then also functions in T-SQL. I want to take advantage of this video to show you some of the functions, some of which, again, you've been using all along, and some that you might be want to be made aware of for future assignments or projects you may be working on. Why are we doing this video? What's T-SQL have to do with everything we've been doing so far? Well, so far you've been learning stored procedures. So your last assignments have all been based on learning how to do a stored procedures using select statements. Pretty easy to do. In some cases, many of you are probably saying, oh, it's a lot easier to do it this way than with inline type of select statements, having to deal with all the quotes and so on. And I would tend to agree. To learn how to do inserts, though, and updates and deletes, the next topic for this week, we need to understand some more, I'm going to say, pieces of what's called T-SQL. So let's dive into this and learn what T-SQL is all about, learn why you've been kind of using it all along, and learn a few more things about it that will allow us to write stored procedures for inserts, updates, and deletes. All right. So a little bit of history. So in 1970s, the product called SQL, Structured English Query Language, was developed by IBM, and later SQL was renamed to SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language. You may already know this. I'm not sure. I thought it might be a nice time just to make sure you understand where SQL came from. In 1986, SQL was approved by the ANSI, American National Standards Institute, and in 1987, it was approved by ISO, the International Standards Organization. And if you do recall from IT 111, we talked about some of the standards that came out of there. Matter of fact, we utilized those standards. I think it was one was from 88, and I think 89, I might be wrong, 87, 89, something like that, where we actually dealt with, let's say, implicit, oh God, I can say it, I'm sorry, implicit joins versus explicit joins. Remember that? SQL is a structured language. SQL is a structured query language, I should say, which is a common database language for all relational database management systems. Different RBMSs, product vendors, have developed their own database language by extending SQL for their own relational database management systems. We talked about several of those systems when we first started IT 111, if you recall. Everything from Oracle to a SQL Server. And there's obviously plenty of others out there. Those are the two biggest robust ones out there. Okay, so each one of those has their own little extension to what actually is SQL. So T-SQL stands for Transact Structured Query Language, which is a Microsoft product. So T-SQL is a Microsoft product and it's an extension of the SQL language. And what that means is, this means that it provides all the functionality of SQL, but with some added benefits to it, some extras, okay? And again, some of those extras you've actually been working with. But for the most part, SQL is SQL, and to learn Transact SQL, you had to learn SQL along the way. Make sense? Most major database vendors offer their own SQL language extensions products for T-SQL, and T-SQL is was one of the most widely used ones because Microsoft SQL Server has become extremely popular. And as I said all along, interesting that everything we have done so far pertaining to SQL Server, everything we taught in IT 111 when it comes to SQL, is really T-SQL. Microsoft doesn't use SQL, it uses T-SQL. And that's Microsoft's own language, okay? Obviously, many parts of T-SQL is SQL, just a few differences and so on. While T-SQL is an extension of SQL, T-SQL is a programming language. T-SQL contains procedural programming and local variables, while SQL does not. T-SQL is proprietary, while SQL is open. So let's dissect this a little bit. Number one, SQL just deals with going and relating to the databases, but T-SQL you can actually is a programming language. As I mentioned before, when it comes to stored procedures, you can write procedural programs using T-SQL. Okay, we're not going to get into that in this course, but you can do more things. You can write different procedures and so on. We're doing stored procedures, but those can even be broken down just like a programming language can, and we can do a lot of things doing a database application in those stored procedures, if you will. Okay, so anyway, it can get very more in depth. The goal right now for this particular course is to introduce, okay, and at least let you see what stored procedures are. But like I said, later on, you may be introduced to stored procedures getting a little bit more complex, if you will. Not really complex, but more program-like, I should say. All right. Some of the differences. I like these differences. Hopefully, this will help explain a little bit. SQL is a query language used for manipulating data stored in a database. T-SQL is also a query language, but it's an extension of SQL that is primarily used for Microsoft. We talked about this already. Okay. SQL Server, SQL is an open source language. Anybody can use it. T-SQL is developed and owned by Microsoft. Okay, so the fact that SQL is open source, that means anybody can use it, anybody can build upon it. That's what these other database management systems have done. They've taken this language and built their own version in a way, or at least added to it. SQL statements are executed one at a time, also known as non-procedural. That's what I just said here a few minutes ago. T-SQL executes statements in a procedural way, meaning that the code will be processed as a block, logically, and in a structured order. Okay, so again, more programming-like. On top of these more general differences, SQL and T-SQL also have some slightly different commands, keywords. T-SQL also features functions that are not part of regular SQL. For instance, if you remember top, when I say select top 1 or select top 1 with ties or select top 10, that's not SQL, that's T-SQL. SQL would use the word limit, all right? You might be going, well, oh my God, now I'm all confused. We've been learning the wrong thing. Not necessarily. You've been learning something based upon what we're using, which is SQL Server. And so over time, you might need to learn what limit is based upon where you work and what you do. But if you work in a SQL Server environment, which is quite a few of those, you'll get that very easily. Okay? T-SQL also offers functionality that does not appear in regular SQL. Is null is one of those. Matter of fact, there's several functions out there that T-SQL provides you that is not part of SQL at all, okay? And again, if you went to Oracle and you use their version of SQL, it'd be the same type thing. This is not difficult stuff. These are just add-ons. These are extensions, okay? Again, all the SQL you have learned, you'll see here in a second, is very similar and to regular SQL. And that's very similar, almost exactly the same. The basis is the same. It's just the little add-on features that Microsoft provided. Oops, sorry about that. There you go. So, like I said, I can almost understand there might be a decent question right now. Well, which is better and which is better and which is better to learn? Well, neither one's better. They're the same. Again, T-SQL is an extension of, not a replacement of, an extension of. In that case. So it always depends on what you're doing. The fact that we teach Microsoft SQL Server, learning T-SQL is what we teach. Also, to learn T-SQL, you really are learning the basics of SQL. You'll discover this if you take future classes dealing with MySQL. We teach classes in doing that in our database, or I'm sorry, in our web application classes. You'll deal with MySQL. You'll see a few of the differences in there. They're not many. You'll just see the limitations in MySQL that you don't, you might be looking for some of these functions that we've been doing all along in MySQL, I should say, that aren't there. So again, the extension's not there, but the basis of everything you've learned up to this point is the same. All right, so let's go take a look at T-SQL. Instead of me making a bunch of slides, I want to take you to this tutorial. I want you to make note of this tutorial. I'll put this in the resources for this week because this really does talk nicely about T-SQL versus just SQL in this case, okay? So I'm going to get out of this and get over to, here we are right here. You'll notice, I'm going to take you right here to the home, okay? And here we are right there, talking about T-SQL. So the link I gave you in this video, you can use to take you right to here. And again, I'll have this under resources for you for this week. You'll see that this is T-SQL. It's not SQL, it's T-SQL. And as we talked about, I'm not going to walk through all the things we just talked about, but to go ahead with this tutorial, familiarity with the database concepts is preferred. It is good to have a good SQL server installed on your computer, and as you might assist you, for example. So we have all that, plus you also should have some database concepts, in this case SQL. Most of the stuff you already know. You'll see in here, we've been doing create tables. That's T-SQL. Okay, drop tables, that's T-SQL. We've been dealing with data types. That's T-SQL. We dealt with inserts. If I clicked on all this stuff, there's an insert. What's it look like to you? It looks like SQL, right? Everything you've learned so far. And I can go through this by group of C, where we got selects, updates, deletes, wheres. Nothing is different in this video learning T-SQL. You've already learned it. Congratulations. Feel free to send us a thank you card if you like or something, okay? Where, like, order by, group by, distinct, joining tables, subqueries, and of course we got into stored procedures, which we'll get into, and so on, okay? So this is pretty much what you have learned so far. Some of the things we want to talk about here in the next few minutes, though, are some of the things where we see in here that are important for us to move on with inserts, updates, and deletes in stored procedure, and that's called transactions. All right? So let's get back to this next piece here. I'm not going to bore you with this. So what is a transaction? Maybe I'll get you there. There you go. And transaction is a unit of work that is performed against a database. So this is part of T-SQL. Okay, transactions are units or sequences of work accomplished in a logical order, whether in a manual fashion by a user or automatically by some sort of database program. For example, instead of fancy words there, if you are creating a record or updating a record or deleting a record, then you are performing what's called a transaction on the table. Selecting is not a transaction. So when you did selects last week in a stored procedure, that was not a transaction. But anytime you add to the database, update a database, or delete from the database, I should say database table for each one of those, that's considered a transaction in T-SQL. Why is that important? Well, we can control things. We can make sure things work properly. And there's ways of doing that that you can actually put in to your commands as you're actually doing this, okay? I will say one of the things that you will notice when we're doing ADO and so on, you won't see these transactions in line, okay? These transactions, you might be able to put them in line. I've never really done that. I've always done them with stored procedures, and that's what we're going to show you in later videos on how to do stored procedures with these transactions in there, okay? So let's go look at what these transactions are all about. Once again, I'm really just pointing back to this right here under transactions, okay? Oops, what did I just do? Black Friday. Well, yes, I'm doing this on that weekend, so sorry about that. All these pop-up ads drives me crazy. Anyway, so a transaction, I kind of told you this part right here. You can read all of this. I kind of want to take you to these pieces right here. I think this is what you'll understand. So what we can do in transactions is control the transactions. We can commit to our changes. We can roll back changes. We can save points within groups of transactions in which we roll back. And we can set transactions, which are places a name on the transaction. So what do I mean by this? The best answer here is the commit command is a transactional command used to save the changes invoked by the transaction in the database. So for instance, if I do this thing called begin transaction, this is how you're going to write your stored procedure. You delete from it. Once you commit to it, okay, it will now save those changes. So it adds a couple steps in there to ensure that what you wanted to change actually becomes part of it. This is called transactional SQL, thus T-SQL, transactional SQL, okay? And so I want to make sure I'm explaining this well. T-SQL deals with transactions, especially when you're updating, deleting, and inserting into tables. So we must actually incorporate these transactions in our stored procedures. I have seen these work in the real world. They're beautiful. It's a way to make sure things are done right. Let's continue on. So the commit's pretty easy. You might be saying, well, what's the big deal? Well, really, there's nothing. But basically, we did this and we committed to it, but we did it explicitly. The programmer said, begin this transaction, delete these customers whose age are 25, and commit to them. And once we're done, if you actually see this 25, 25, I might not try those names, and then you'll see they're gone right here. Okay? Look at this next command, though. This command has saved many, many, many companies. The rollback command is a transactional command used to undo transactions that have not already been saved to the database. This command can only be used to undo transactions since the last commit or rollback command was issued. So I can do that delete, commit to it. If all of a sudden I realize, based upon what was being done, that I shouldn't have deleted that, or I deleted the wrong ones, I can do a rollback and bring back all those rows back to my table. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that if you're doing millions and millions of transactions in a very sophisticated company, having the ability to roll back when maybe something didn't work correctly, maybe something got interrupted during the middle of the transaction itself and so on, is a really good thing. And that's what this transactional SQL is all about. Okay? Those are a couple of the biggies I really wanted you to see. So in this case here, I can begin the transaction and roll these back, these delete customers, and roll back and get them all back in this case. Okay? And again, I can run that rollback after I commit, as long as this is the last commit to actually happen. If somebody else snuck in there with another commit, I can't roll back anymore. It's going to be the rollback. We're rolling back from the last commit. All right. Finally, let's see a couple more. Save point is a point of transaction where you can roll the transaction back to a certain point without rolling back the entire transaction. Again, we're getting into some pretty sophisticated database stuff here, but I can create transactions such as this, where I can begin a transaction, save it as here, delete the customer, save that transaction, and so on. And I can then roll back certain pieces of it if I really wanted to. All right, that's what that's all about. Set transaction command can be used to initiate database transactions. This command is used specifically for specified characteristics for the transaction as follow. Set transaction and so on. We may have seen those in some of the things we've been doing all the way through here when we actually built our databases and so on, IT 111, that set command. Okay? And so what's interesting is, like I said, you've been using T-SQL sort of all along. The one biggie I want you to see right now, though, is that, setting up these transactions, begin transaction, and then commit. That's really all we're going to be practicing. But I hope out of this video you kind of got the idea that you kind of get the idea that's what T-SQL was all about. There's one more piece here I want to talk about, and that's functions. Though we will practice a few functions throughout the remaining of the course, but what's kind of nice is knowing that T-SQL also provides you these functions, okay? And so Microsoft SQL Server has many built-in functions to perform processing on string or numeric data. And let's go back and look at this. I'll come back up here, get past all my ads here, and we get into functions. And you'll see plenty of functions. Now, what functions have you seen used so far? Oh, look at that. Count, max, min, average, sum. Yep, those aggregates that we practiced in IT 111 and also so far in this course, correct? Yep, those are functions as part of T-SQL. Those are not the same functions that could be part of Oracle. They might be, but really those are extended things as part of Transact SQL, part of Microsoft SQL Server. As you see, there is a square root function. There's a random access function. There is a concatenation function. I think I've had different students use that before. There are different numeric functions and string functions that you can actually get into. If you click on this, you'll see quite a few numeric functions as you go in here. There's date functions, and they go on, okay, in this case. So I really welcome you to go take a look at these. and kind of familiarize yourself with a lot of the stuff. So from numeric functions to the string functions and so on, because you may need to use them, or it might really help you in whatever assignment or I'm getting all these ads. Obviously, it's Black Friday. Assignment or project you may be working on. All right. Okay, let's go back here once again. I think I forgot about functions as when I was talking the last time, but as we kind of go through here, so now it's time to have an introductory knowledge. Now that you have an introductory knowledge of this, I wanted to make sure before I started, introducing you to stored procedures for inserts, updates, and deletes, and I start introducing this whole concept of a begin transaction and a commit, that you had an idea where this all came from. And so hopefully throughout this video, you get the idea that you have been learning this thing called T-SQL. And now to write stored procedures for these upcoming pieces, these transactions we're going to be working with, now you have an idea what transactions is all about and what T-SQL is all about. So yes, if somebody asks you, do you know T-SQL? The answer is you do. You actually were taught that in IT 111 and all the way through IT 102. And you can easily put that on your resume that you not only know SQL, but you know T-SQL. Congratulations.